Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar this evening. I'm really excited that we've got Dr. John Harvey and Justine Shotton that are here tonight that are going to be talking to you about evidence-based insights into the environmental impact of dog food. So thank you very much for giving up your evening. I hope you've got some nice sunny weather with you as well as we have here. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to Vet Sustain. I'm sure a lot of you know who Vet Sustain are. We're a community interest company and we're working to champion sustainability within the veterinary professions. And we often run these webinars across the course of the year on interesting topics that we think might pique your interest and help you to go on your own sustainability journey in practice. So thank you very much for coming along this evening. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this meeting and this will be going onto YouTube so you can re-watch the meeting back. I would just ask everybody to keep themselves muted if that's okay. We will have a discussion after John's presentation, but it would just be helpful if you stay muted. Please don't be offended if I do mute you if there's some background noise. It's just to make sure that it doesn't disrupt the presentation too much. And please can I ask that you put questions in the chat. You're also very welcome to unmute and ask a question at the end. But whilst the presentation is going on, if you could pop them into the chat and we'll then collate the questions and be able to ask John and have a bit of a discussion towards the end of the meeting. So I'm going to pass over to Justine Shotton, who's our chair for this evening. So thank you, Justine.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Hannah, and welcome everyone. It's really great to have you listening in tonight. This is a topic that fascinates me, and I think we're going to learn a lot from John. So I'm really grateful to John for talking to us about this quite complex but very interesting and exciting area. And I think one that is really helpful for us as veterinary professionals and people interested in the carbon paw print to understand better. So I'm Justine. I'm one of the directors of Vet Sustain. I also work at RSPCA as a head vet for wildlife and exotics, and I'm a previous BVA president and a zoo vet before that. So have had quite a variety of different experiences, but I'm particularly interested in carbon paw prints and things like the environmental impact of feeding our pets, which is quite significant. I'd also like to introduce John. So John's worked as a practicing vet and in the international development and animal welfare sector, so another huge range of experience across the board. And his research approach really reflects this cross-disciplinary background. He's involved with Edinburgh and Exeter universities and also has the Pets and Planet website, which you can have a look at, looking at some of the work that he does there. And his research interests that he's going to be talking about today is around the environmental impacts of feeding our pet cats and dogs. But also he does research into the wider impacts of our pets, such as pollution from medicine use, which is again a hot topic at the moment, predation and wildlife disturbance, and impacts from pet waste. So without further ado, I'm very excited to hand over to John. Please, as he talks through this topic, do put your questions in the chat, and there will be some time at the end for Q&A. So really excited to hear what you've got to say. Over to you, John.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you very much for allowing me to speak tonight and for everyone giving up some of your evening to listen to this. So my background is, as Justine said, I'm a vet. And my journey into doing research really was when I was in practice. I was interested in the environmental impacts of pets. I was working in companion animal practice. And I started looking into it and I thought, hang on a minute, it looks like food might be quite a big impact, but it doesn't seem like there's actually really good evidence around that. And so I've since been on a journey. I've done a master's in sustainability, and now I'm doing research into the environmental impact of feeding dogs and cats. And at each stage in that journey, it's become clear that there are really big gaps. So Justine mentioned the petsandplanet.org website. That contains the current research that we've done and also sort of reviews everything that I'll talk about tonight and the sort of evidence available, and that will be continue to be kept updated. And really, I've put that as a resource for vets, owners, and others who are on a similar journey to the one I've been on, to sort of help answer some of those questions. So tonight, I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have time for discussion and questions. As Justine mentioned, please pop questions in the chat as you go, and Justine will collate them. If I happen to see one that I can answer straight away, I might answer it then. So we'll have a think about why this topic might actually matter to us. I do need to talk a little bit about some important concepts behind it, because unfortunately, without talking about these, discussing the research becomes impossible. I'm then going to move on to clinical application and actually try and go through a case example that we might be in practice and think about how we might support an owner to feed in a less environmentally harmful way. So I guess for most people, you'll be familiar that greenhouse gases are increasing. Now, that's not only carbon dioxide, but it's also methane and nitrous oxide. And each of them have different periods that they stay in the atmosphere for. So, for example, methane is actually relatively short-lived. It only lasts 12 years in the atmosphere, but it has a really big warming effect. And we can see that global temperatures are rising, in sync really with this rise in greenhouse gases. And we have now exceeded the Paris target of 1.5 degrees, more or less. El Nino might mean, you might argue one way or another. But it's not only temperature, it's unpredictability of weather, natural disasters. And the other thing to think about is that we're relatively protected here in the UK. A lot of the really worst impacts of climate change are going to happen in countries which are less able to adjust to them and perhaps already have weather patterns and shortage of water resources and challenges like that that will make them even more vulnerable. But it's not just about carbon. This diagram here is something called the planetary boundaries. And what it demonstrates is all of these effects that we are having on the planet, and where we're going beyond what the planet can sustain, the safe operating zone, that green bit in the middle. And you'll see for some things like novel entities, we're well outside it and perhaps even more outside it than climate change. And pets have multiple impacts on a lot of these different areas. So those impacts include things like predatory behavior and chasing, but even just presence in an area has a big impact on animal populations. Recently, there's been some great work done by Vet Sustain, and we are now starting to talk about the effect of wash-off of veterinary products into water, which can have quite profound effects on insect populations, but also in other areas of the ecosystem. And things like urine and feces, I often get asked about feces. If dog feces is left in pretty much any environment, it's going to cause a problem. That's going to include sensitive nature reserves where the fertilization effect of dog feces will totally change the ecosystems. It's going to include polluting water sources. So I'm afraid the flick with a stick really isn't acceptable. We need to bag dog poo and put it in a bin, and that's probably the best thing. We've got the example of novel entities on the left. Well, we see that in our work. Some of our pharmaceuticals might be those novel entities. And the other thing to be aware of is we might be having impacts which are a long way away from where we are. So, for example, medicine production might be in India. We're using the medicines here, but there might be big environmental effects there. So there's lots of impacts potentially tied up in pet ownership that we're maybe not immediately aware of. When we think about kind of how do we find a good balance for people? I find this model, which is something called donut economics, really useful. And you'll see those planetary boundaries around the outside. And in the inside, you'll see the critical needs that we have for humans in the center. So humans need water, food, health, education, and so on. And the hope is, and there probably is, a safe place where we can be meeting all the key needs for humans without transgressing the planetary boundaries in an unsustainable way. And a question would be is, can we fit pets within that safe, just space? And I think it's important that we can. And a question that I would be asking is, what is future fit pet guardianship? How do we get to a place where pets aren't excessively contributing to the ecosphere breakdown, that where pets can adapt to changing climate conditions, and so we can all have healthy pets with high welfare, with all the benefits that that brings to societies? And a question that comes up quite often, or I've heard being brought up, is why should dogs or cats have to change their diet, often with what I'm talking about, or other lifestyle because of human-induced climate change? And I think in that respect, the concept of One Health frame is quite useful. And I know this diagram keeps varying, but that overall key message is it is about the health and welfare of animals. Humans, animals, and the environment are totally intertwined. Animals will be experiencing climate change. Animals are contributing to climate change in the way that we as people keep them. And so we do need to be considering them in this broader picture. So now moving on and starting to focus down on food, we know that food ingredient emissions must reduce to meet climate targets. The food system, I'm talking about the general food system, is around 1/3 of current emissions. And if we look at any of these potential future journeys for where we need emissions to go, we can see that they are going to have to fall. For dogs, we also know that foods are by far the vast majority of their environmental footprint. When we look at something called life cycle analysis of a dog's whole life, it's really dominated by the food that the dogs are eating. And when we look at the food system, and this is principally the human food system this is based on, although within this there would be feed for animals, including dogs and cats, we can see that ingredients dominate. They're about 70% of impacts. So it's really important to think about the impacts of food. But as I said, with the general climate situation, it's not just about carbon. I am going to talk quite a lot about greenhouse gas emissions today, but I will keep referencing back to other impacts. We can see that, especially in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, meat production is a really high percentage of the impacts, and it's expected to grow. But other non-emission impacts are really important in the terms of what impacts food are having. As we can see from the other diagrams, meat impacts may dominate them less. Some impacts aren't listed here. For example, loss of species and ecosystem loss would be another example. And so when we're looking at any decision within the food system, there's always trade-offs. So you might be producing less carbon, but for example, if you're producing more crops, you might be having more of an effect on nitrogen and phosphorus loading of the environment. And when we specifically go and look at dog feeding, there's actually quite a lot of variations in estimates between different researchers, but there's a really consistent message. Impacts are big. It doesn't matter whether the estimate's been done by industry, academic researchers, and there's a range of views within academic research, so I'll come on to in a moment. The impacts are always big. This 1% of UK emissions is an estimate from our paper, calculated using an approach which considers uncertainty. The comparison I give there in terms of aviation is to give an idea of scale. It considers what emissions would be globally if all dogs were fed on a food mix similar to what they are in the UK. So it doesn't include lots of things. It doesn't include the contrail effect of aviation, but equally, it doesn't include a lot of factors around dogs, including the impacts of their feces and urine on the environment. It doesn't include packaging of food and so on. So there's lots of caveats, but the point is the scale's big. We hear about aviation emissions all the time. We don't hear about or think about pet food emissions that much. And I think as we go forward in this discussion, it's really, really important to be aware that there's a genuine dilemma for pet owners. There are a lot of strongly held views around food, as we know, and pet owners may well be choosing or want to choose a less processed, natural diet for themselves and perhaps mirror that in their pets. There's obviously narratives around wolf-like ancestral diets and so on that are influencing how people are choosing to feed their pets and how they believe it's best to do so. And equally, there may be pressure that vet pets should be vegan, and people feeling a pressure that environmentally they should be making their pet vegan. And so I think recognizing that's really important if we're actually going to start thinking about how we support owners to perhaps consider the environmental impact of the food they're feeding to their pet in their decision-making process. So a really critical starting point in thinking about pet food environmental impacts is the type of meat which is contributing to pet food and how we understand its impacts. Because as with human food, especially in terms of emissions, meat is very important, and there's a lot of meat potentially in pet food. I don't particularly need to dwell on the details of all the figures in this diagram, but this demonstrates the variation in results of previous studies when we were starting out looking at research. Now, the blue studies are something called life cycle analysis, which is regarded as a kind of gold standard, and it tries to break down everything that contributes to the environmental impact of a food. So that includes packaging and so on. The ones highlighted by the ones near the top in blue, the FEDIAF ones, are for an average European food. When we look at the green examples, what's happened there is that there's been an assessment of the energy needs of a population of animals, of dogs typically, or cats. In some cases, that has all been done although this diagram I've just put dogs on. And then taking an average composition, potentially, for example, assuming all protein is chicken, and then working out what the environmental impacts would be. And the final group, the orange ones, there's been an attempt to estimate the composition of foods and then look at what the environmental impacts would be. Now, I think the biggest thing to be aware of here is the range of estimates has been enormous. And I think it's fair to say that I find that longest bar hard to regenerate through a calculation process. So I'm not quite sure how we ended up with an estimate quite as high as that wet food estimate, that really long one. But one of the key places where we're getting variation between studies is how the environmental impacts of meat are calculated. And when we're thinking about meat, typically we can think about the carcass in two parts. One is what I'll refer to as prime meat, and that's a type of meat that is typically being eaten by humans. And then I'll refer to pretty much everything else as animal byproducts. And so those are bits of the carcass, many of which are nutritionally rich. They might just be trimmings. In the way that I allocate the carcass, it includes a lot of organ meat like liver and kidney, which is totally fine for humans to be eating. It's just the preference is not to eat it in this country. And when we take the environmental impact of meat, the starting point is always the environmental impact of the whole animal. And then we have to split it up. And one approach is to say, okay, for every kilogram of the cow in this example, we allocate the same proportion of impacts. And that's something called mass allocation. Now, the problem with that, or the challenge that I would see with that, is that a kilogram of prime steak that might sell for £50 a kilogram is allocated the same environmental impacts as a kilogram of grass that was eaten by the cow in the lairage just before it went in for slaughter. Or trimmings, or bits of bone, or kidney, or whatever else. They're all allocated the same amount. So to overcome that challenge, another approach to allocation is something called economic allocation. And there what happens is the environmental impact of the different parts of the carcass is scaled according to their value. So if we have a kilogram of beef steak, which is worth £50, and we have another meat product which is worth £5, then the steak would have 10 times the environmental impacts allocated to it per kilo of the other product that was worth 1/10 of the price. An economic allocation is the most preferred approach to allocate impacts to meat products by people who do life cycle analysis, life cycle analysis practitioners. Now, something else has happened in quite a lot of studies of pet food. And what has happened is that a figure has been used from the literature for the environmental impact of a meat product, which has been calculated for prime meat using economic allocation. And then that figure has been applied to all carcass products. So what happens then is you actually dramatically overestimate the total impact of the cow. And that's happened in multiple published studies, including that one with that very long bar that I highlighted in the summary of the studies before. Now, I use all of these approaches in the research I'm going to show you, so you'll be able to see the comparison of these different allocation approaches. Another thing just to quickly touch on is what are animal byproducts and how are they being allocated? Well, we know we've got the prime meat and the animal byproducts. And the animal byproducts are broken down into 3 groups: lower risk ones, so called category 3, and then medium, high, and higher risk ones. And the concept would be that category 3 ones should go into pet food. In fact, every bit of meat that goes into pet food should be category 3. So it's an animal byproduct. It's not prime meat suitable for human food. And then the medium and high risk ones should go to biofuel production, energy recovery, fertilizers. And there's something called waste hierarchy, which would kind of say, with a product of an animal, the first thing you should do with it is feed it to humans. If you can't feed it to humans, feed it to animals. If you can't feed it to animals, you might use it as fertilizer. And then the sort of bottom choice, if you can't do any of those things, you use it for energy recovery. Now, what actually happens in practice is we get some reclassification from human food to category 3, and that's according to market demand. So the market says, well, actually, there's not enough demand for liver, therefore it's going to be reclassified as category 3. And in the same way, we are also seeing a situation where there is some reclassification of stuff in category 3 down to category 2 and 1. And there's a pressure to do that, which is actually starting to cause quite a lot of concern, and that is biofuels. So there's been some recent real concern from the pet food industry about getting enough animal fat for pet foods because biofuels are placing demand on it. And going forward, the key approach that the aviation industry has to being net zero is so-called sustainable aviation fuel, and a key ingredient of that potentially is animal fats. So this means that whole system impacts can really change depending on demand. So if we have really big demand for animal fats for biofuels, that might change their price, their availability for pet food. So going longer term, we really need to be thinking about the whole system impacts of what ingredients are being used in pet food. So coming on to the research and what we found. And this is principally based on our recent paper. You can find that on petsandplanet.org. I will also mention some results from ongoing work, which is currently being reviewed. And that will go on to petsandplanet.org and be updated as soon as the next paper has been published. So what have we done? Well, we started off at Pets at Home website collecting data on the ingredients and the typical analysis, so the protein and fat and so on, of as many dog foods as we could. And we had about just under 1,000 that we were able to process the data for. Then, by taking information on the composition of individual ingredients from databases of ingredient nutrients and combining that together with the information from the label on the final composition, what we were able to do was say, okay, well, if the food has 10 ingredients in it, the amount of protein in the 10 ingredients needs to add up to the protein in the listed on the label for the final food. And so by doing that, we're able to estimate the composition of the food. We then take that composition and combine it with a meta-analysis, so a big study of the environmental impacts of different individual ingredients, which combines many, many different assessments, as well as using mass and economic allocation, having calculated out the different factors to achieve that. We're then able to add up the impacts of each of the individual ingredients in a food to calculate an impact for the whole food. And then what we finally do is we say, okay, well, we've got actually some uncertainty in things. So for example, we might have uncertainty in the protein level of an ingredient. We'll have some uncertainty in the different prices that there might be, which would influence the economic allocation. And so we run this 1,000 times and we change all those assumptions to get to our final sort of results. So the first question is, well, how accurate is this approach? And this graph shows you something called the composite environmental impact score, which combines greenhouse gas emissions, land use, a type of water use called scarcity weighted, and eutrophication, which is essentially linked to the effect of fertilizer on the land. And it combines those things together. And what it compares is it compares an estimate of the environmental impact coming from foods where they list the percentage of every ingredient on the label, compared to what our model estimates when we don't tell it the different percentages of the different ingredients. And that's shown when we don't give it the percentages told, it's shown in red, and you can see it's fairly good fit. When we actually give the model the percentages from the label, as you'd hope, it tightens it up a bit more. So we've got that built in as well. But overall, our model is able to pretty accurately estimate the real composition of a food, even if all it gets is a list of ingredients. And when we apply that to 1,000 different foods, or just under 996 different foods, we're then able to see what the pattern is of impacts for different food types. And on the left-hand graph, we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions. On the right-hand, we're looking at this composite environmental impact score. And really, I put them both up just to show that the pattern's kind of similar, whichever you look at. The different food types we look at are dry, D, wet, W, and R, raw. And then there's plant-based and grain-free versions of the dry and the wet food. What we can see is that wet and raw food impacts, in terms of the median impacts, are typically clearly higher than dry. Grain-free foods have higher impact than equivalent main market foods, and that's statistically significant. In this study, plant-based foods were not statistically different to the main market foods. We didn't study many of them in this study. And it is worth saying that the lowest impact food contained meat. Another thing to see is there's lots of outliers. So there's lower impact options of all food types, but there's also some pretty high ones. So, if you look at dry food, there's a few outlier dry foods which have really high impacts. And so, I think while I am going to make some comments about potentially certain formats tend to be lower impact, there are lower impact options however you're feeding. And there is no wrong way to feed environmentally in terms of format. You just need to be thinking about what's going in there. From our recent study, fresh food options are likely to have similar impacts to raw and wet grain-free foods. And a really key thing to note is there's about a 65-fold difference in emissions intensity between products. So it's an enormous range. I talked about allocation and how important that was. And on these graphs, the dashed line is at the same level across all the graphs because they're different scales. The graph compares economic allocation, which I'm principally talking about, mass allocation, which actually no one has applied properly in the literature, really, because what has tended to happen is people have actually done no allocation, so on the right. And you can see that the pattern, whichever allocation approach we take, is actually quite similar. The heights of the bars, there's kind of a similar pattern there. The big difference is meat byproduct contribution. That's the purple color. And that's what you'd expect, because in economic allocation, the environmental contribution of meat is actually relatively small. Of meat byproducts, it's relatively small to the total impacts. Whereas in mass allocation and no allocation, they're more prevalent. Another thing I'll just mention on this is the dark blue section, which is fish. Fish has been totally ignored in many previous studies, and that's because it's really difficult to get good figures. We did not apply economic allocation for fish impacts in our study. So on the economic allocation graph, it's potential we're kind of overestimating fish impacts, but that's because it's so hard to get figures. We have now got some estimates in the next paper, but there's still a lot of assumptions around that. But what we can see is that this no allocation is going to potentially overestimate impacts significantly. When we compare dog diets and human diets, and this is a 20.1 kilogram dog because this was reported as an average globally, which is why that number's been picked. This shows every diet we studied as an individual dog. The green line is a UK human vegan diet, and the red line is a human high meat diet. And what we can see is if you're feeding an average dog on anything other than dry food, it's potentially going to have a similar impact scale to a human diet, and there's potential for it to be much greater. And of course, there might be multiple dogs within a household. And then the other thing to notice is the difference between a human vegan diet and a high meat diet is about 2.5-fold difference in impacts, whereas we've got a 65-fold difference in the impacts of dog diets. So for the potential for reduction impacts for changes to pet diets is actually really enormous and potentially greater than changes in human diets. This looks at us where we've run the model 1,000 times with some random variation in key assumptions. And what the left-hand graph is looking at is what happens if we get a shift from dry food to different food types. And on the right-hand graph, it's what happens if people shift from wet food to different food types. And you've got all the different allocation approaches. So you've got economic allocation in sort of brown, mass allocation in blue, and then no allocation in green. And what it allows us to see is that regardless of the allocation approach, dry food is likely preferable to wet or especially raw. And that's, again, talking about the averages. We see some benefit from plant-based. It's greater definitely for wet foods than dry foods. You see the difference when we look at economic allocation, the brown between the dry main market and dry plant-based is relatively little. And you see less difference by moving to a plant-based food than you see obviously between the difference between dry and wet. And I think that's key. We also see that it's likely that grain-free is going to be a more environmentally harmful option than the sort of main market foods. And again, we're talking the average or the median foods all the time here. This graph is really just to show it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions. It's based on dog food sales globally, which actually only supply about less than 20% of the energy I would calculate to feed the global dog population. There's two things I would highlight here. Firstly, the proportion of global food agricultural impacts that you can allocate to dog food are reasonably similar across all those different impact categories. So that's greenhouse gas emissions, land use, acidifying emissions, eutropifying emissions, freshwater use, and stress-weighted water use, which is kind of where you look at water use, but you look at how scarce it is in that particular area where it's being used. The second thing I'd highlight is that no allocation will overestimate impacts. I think no allocation consistently is producing results which are way too high, as we'd expect. Now, do we only need to consider ingredients? Probably not. This is looking at life cycle analysis, where they've looked at all the different categories of the environmental impacts from pet foods. And we can see for dry foods, the ingredient impacts dominate. But for wet foods, in both the studies, which have been done independently of one another, transport, packaging, production has actually been really quite significant. Now, we've not yet incorporated this into our model, but it is something we're thinking about how we do in the future. I think it is also important to bear in mind that the ingredient impacts of the products in these graphs are from products based on animal byproducts or plant-based, and so relatively lower. The ingredient impacts of the median raw or wet grain free foods are about 6 times the impact of the wet foods shown here. So I think then, the proportion of related to the non-ingredients bit would be down, but it's still a little bit to add on top when we're thinking about potential impacts of different food types. I obviously haven't talked about cats at all. That's because they've not been in our first study. The studies that have looked at both dog and cat food suggest similar patterns are likely to be found. Cats are obviously smaller than dogs. There's a similar number of cats and dogs in the UK probably. So the total climate footprint is likely to be less because there's a lot less food eaten. But we will be looking at cat food in some of our future work. But I would say you can kind of apply the same information and concepts to cats as dogs based on what we know at the moment. So, as I said at the beginning, I really think clients face a genuine dilemma. And one of the questions is, how can we as veterinary professionals help support clients? And I think one of the first things to be aware of when considering how sustainable foods are is whether we may have an aspect of marketing, and I use the term greenwashing, perhaps to be a little bit contentious, around how sustainability claims are potentially presented. And I think we need to have a sort of critical eye on when we're looking at. One of the first things is thinking about when a claim's being made about the environmental impact of a product, what is the functional unit? Because the energy density of wet and dry food are very different. So if you're comparing on a basis of weight, then you've got to be really careful because obviously you need a lot more kilograms of wet food, which contains a lot of water, to feed an animal than we do of dry food. We often see in marketing an emphasis on sustainable packaging, but if we've talked about, it's generally not a high proportion of impacts in higher impact foods, even for wet foods. So, it's great if there's a reduction in the impacts from packaging, but ingredients really matter. And I've certainly seen some graphs being presented by manufacturers. The graphs being presented by manufacturers sometimes show packaging impacts as being what they're really working on. And then there's these unlabeled bars of the ingredient impacts. I think we need to be suspicious of that. Sustainability marketing has then tended to dominate products marketed as premium, but actually there's loads of products out there which aren't mentioning sustainability, maybe based on animal byproducts and have potentially much lower impacts. So just because it's been marketed as sustainable doesn't mean it necessarily is. I'm going to talk a little bit about novel ingredients in a moment. There's a lot of variation in how manufacturers of novel ingredients are estimating impact, and this is a challenge for the industry as well. So I don't think we can automatically assume that novel ingredients, so I'm meaning things like insects or cultured meat, or there's lots of things being talked about. I don't think we can automatically assume that novel ingredients are less impactful. And the final thing to be aware of is the moisture content of ingredients can be used to manipulate the order and make it look like there's more meat in a product or less meat in a product. And that's frequently done. So for example, a manufacturer could put chicken as the first ingredient on a label, and then in brackets, the first thing is chicken broth. Chicken broth is basically just water. And so that can be used in different ways to manipulate how you might perceive what's in a food. I mentioned these alternative protein options. There's a rapid growth in these insect-based foods becoming quite widely available. There are some, with insect-based food, there's at least a tenfold range of estimates of insect production. And there's some questions coming up in the academic literature about how we look at the environmental impacts of insect production. More recent studies I've done, I think, would suggest that for wet foods, insect-based foods are likely to be lower impact than main market foods based on meat, because often they contain more prime meat, the wet products. But I think we still need to have some caution. In general, many of the alternative proteins may show benefits environmentally when compared to human food chain products. But if we're looking to buy products, they may not actually be having an environmental benefit. So I think there's great potential here, but I think the evidence there is perhaps less established than some of the marketing might suggest. I think probably quite an important thing to do in terms of reducing environmental impacts is thinking about how we're framing byproducts and move away from the kind of keep filler stigma that sometimes is done. From an animal welfare point of view, which actually there's some evidence that animal welfare may be more important to some clients in environmental sustainability in the decision-making process. Using the whole animal is a really important thing, because then you farm a lot less animals. In some parts of the world, and I quite like this picture because these are obviously parts of the animal that aren't so typically in the UK, which are clearly being used and eaten in many parts of the world frequently. They've got great nutritional value. So it's important, whatever food format is being fed, and potentially especially so for raw feeders or those topping up with human foods, that people are thinking about which meat products are going into the food that's being fed. So overall, what changes pet feeding impacts? Well, the first thing would be the mass of pets to feed. So that might also have other benefits if that is reduced, for example, related to biodiversity impacts, medicine residues, and so on. So, potentially people could choose to have smaller pets, fewer pets per house. We could have fewer pet-owning households, rehoming instead of breeding, shared or temporary ownership arrangements. All of this kind of reduces the mass of pets to be fed, which reduces the amount of pet food we need. Food trends, which are often human-linked, may well be increasing the environmental impact of pet feeding. So, for example, grain-free feeding, narratives about prime cuts of meat, narratives like human grade. And I mean, a lot of the industry is quite uncomfortable with that. These may all be pushing up the environmental impacts of the food that's being fed. Equally, food trends towards plant-based feeding might help decrease the environmental impacts of pet food. Waste of food is really key. And obviously, the immediate thing you think about is, food going off and so on and so forth. Well, actually, the biggest form of waste we see is overfeeding. And clearly, keeping a dog an ideal body condition score is a win on pretty much every scale, although it can still be really challenging to achieve. But it really reduces the total volume of food and amount of carbon and environmental impact over a lifetime. And I think it's worth being aware that treats can have substantial impacts too. We didn't include them in this first study that I'm talking about at the moment, but our next study, we do look at them, and treats have a substantial impact too. And I will mention that again in just a moment. And then the final thing is composition. So not feeding excessive meat protein. A lot of foods have far higher protein than is actually needed by a dog. Thinking about the impact of packaging, distribution, refrigeration when we're thinking about food format may be relevant, as we talked about. And for, potentially wet foods, raw foods may have higher impacts than dry foods. And I think also then obviously talking about lower impact ingredients, especially the protein sources. And so this picture of a dog, which was a stock photo I found, I thought I'd then take forward as a bit of a case study. So here we have Bella, a 4-year-old neutered female Labrador. Her weight, I decided, was about 42 kilograms. And I just decided she was going to be fed on a wet grain-free lamb diet. And I looked up a random one on the internet, and I've based my stuff on that. I had figures for the impacts of that individual diet. I said she was being fed according to the manufacturer's recommendation for her weight. She was also receiving 3 pouches of lamb and pork-based treats a week. And I guess she might be getting some table scraps or home cooked treat meals as well. So in this diagram, each of my aeroplanes represents one return London to New York long haul flight per year for annual emissions. So, you know, the annual emissions for her current food would be about 10 return flights between London and New York. And the current food is based on lamb and butternut squash, as you can see. And this is a real food, a real ingredients list that I just extracted. The treats would contribute about another one-way flight London to New York per year. So these were some swaps. Same manufacturer, just very similarly blended foods. And if we look at the ingredients, really quite similar. They're all based on a protein source and sweet potato or butternut squash. If we go to a wet chicken-based food, we've reduced the food impacts to about 30% of being on a land-based diet. The dry lamb-based food is actually, as you can see, slightly higher than the wet chicken-based food, although of course we've not included packaging impacts, transport in this, so that might change that balance a bit. But if we go to a dry chicken-based, we've managed to reduce the impacts for the same amount of food, but to 10%. And the reason is that we've got more byproducts in the dry chicken-based food, and we've also got a lower overall meat percentage in the dry foods than the wet foods. It is a little bit complicated because obviously you've got the impact of water in here, because we do have some 15% dried ground chicken, that's chicken meal in the dry chicken base, but still overall we've got less chicken in the dry version than the wet version. And if we also move from a lamb and pork based treat to a chicken liver based treat by the same manufacturer, that would have a 10-fold difference in environmental impacts. And if we were to say, for example, move Bella to the dry chicken based food, but leave her on her original treats, then her treats would be about a third of the total dietary greenhouse gas emissions that she'd be having. We might have some table scraps being fed. Well, that's likely to be human grade food, human grade meat. And so obviously that potentially could be really high impact. We haven't studied that at all. Now, I reckon we could afford to have Bella reduce some calories. We all know how difficult these discussions can be. But I'm going to say if we had a 30% less calories, a discussion with an owner might focus on Bella and her health benefits. And we all know how difficult those discussions can be, but it's discussions that we might be having. We can talk about changing the food to one with really similar ingredients, same manufacturer. So we're not downgrading her food, we're just making a change there. I was quite surprised when I calculated the financial benefits. Over £1,000 a year cost savings on food. And I'm going to argue you probably have quite a lot of reduced vet bills, because when I used to be in practice doing surgery, I felt quite a lot of the cases I saw were directly related to obesity. And then I think I'd be tempted to introduce the planetary benefits as a positive side effect, kind of reinforcing the decision to change. And with what the changes we've talked about, we've got at least a 94% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the format and protein change. And then on top of that, we would have further reductions due to packaging, manufacturing and transport and so on. And arguably, you might have less wasted food with a dry food than a wet food. So pretty much at the end there, I've run slightly longer than I thought I might. So just to summarize some really key points. I think we want to feed less, both in terms of volume of food and the amount of protein we're feeding, avoiding feeding excessive meat protein. Be thinking about checking the ingredients. So poultry, animal byproducts are likely to be lower impact ingredients, whereas ruminant, prime cuts likely to be higher impact, and plant-based can be a consideration. Think about format. Dry foods may be lower impact. It's not an absolute thing. I think we want to be really careful we don't demonize anyone for the feeding choices they're making, but on average, dry foods, it can be easier to find lower impact options. And then if we've got claims being made about sustainability, make sure we're fact checking them. Think about whether packaging claims are likely to be like claims around packaging, is whether that's the key thing, and the claims being made on packaging, is that are they really an accurate source? Be aware many lower impact foods don't make any claims, and make sure we're comparing on the basis of nutritional value. So finally, just to thank my co-authors, Peter, Vera and Sarah. I work at the University of Edinburgh. I'm also work out of Exeter, work between the two. I'm funded by BBSRC, which is independent funding. And I'll just highlight again petsandplanet.org. I saw a question about references. All the references and a lot more are on there. That's relevant to veterinary professionals and the general public, and will be kept up to date with resources going forward. And I'd really welcome any questions and thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. That was fascinating, and it's so complex but so interesting, and you explained it really well. So thank you very much. And I'll definitely be watching back to sort of get some of the facts and figures again. I mean, I just had a sort of personal question, comment is more around the animal welfare side. Obviously, we are more worried about intensive chicken farming, for example, than maybe farming lambs. So it's hard to also factor in that angle too when you're trying to juggle all of these things into it. I know there's no easy answers, but do you think in the future we'll be moving more towards higher percent plant ingredients possibly to mitigate some of that? Or any comments around that?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting one. I think one of the critical things that comes around that, and I'm not sure how we fit that in with animal welfare, is that I'm not convinced that animal byproduct demand drives agricultural demand. So if we think about poultry, it's people purchasing chicken breasts and prime bits of chicken that drives the market. And so we actually have a whole load of chicken carcasses left. Now, the question is, if you weren't using them in pet food, would you produce less chickens? Would you change that demand? Or would those chicken carcasses simply be used for something else? Now, I would argue an optimal use of them might be lots more people making chicken soup. And there's no reason you can't. But the truth is, not enough people use them in that way. So if the other option is that those chicken carcasses, which have had the breasts removed, are going to go to waste or potentially to be used as biofuel, then I think it's probably better they're used for pet food than we feed our pets plants and those chicken carcasses go to waste. And our overall environmental benefit, I think, will be aligned with an overall total animal welfare impact, if that makes sense. So, and I think, there's lots of arguments about what happens with human diets. If you actually look at the studies of what is currently predicted for what happens with human diets, meat production isn't going down very soon. But I do think this is something we need to think about. We know now that there's probably a reasonable balance that a dog can be fed a non-meat diet quite safely. The BVA has come out with some really helpful guidelines around that. I think for cats, I think there's still some concerns raised by the BVA guidelines, and I think that's a reasonable position to work from. So yeah, I mean, potentially we can feed dogs vegan diets, but if you compare currently, based on the current environmental impacts, a product based on meat byproducts and a dry product based on plant ingredients, you'll probably find the plant-based one has higher environmental impacts than the byproduct-based one. Over time, that may change depending on market demand. Now, how do we convert that to animal welfare? That is a really challenging one. and how, if we have high welfare pet food being marketed that's actually based effectively on prime meat cuts, is the, but from a source where the meat is regarded as having higher welfare standards, is that actually a better animal welfare outcome than a non-certified source of animal protein that might otherwise be going to waste? I'm not sure, and I'm probably not the best person here to answer that question.
No, it's fascinating. And yeah, thanks for explaining all of that, because it's easy to not think about all of the angles, especially with regard to the waste, of animal byproducts as well. So thank you. We've got a few comments and sort of questions coming in. And I think one of the main ones that Matt's has sort of highlighted is the fact that obesity has such a big impact. And absolutely, like you said, John, that's the big win all round for animal welfare of the pets, animal welfare of the feed animals, and the planet, and people's pockets as well. So I think, as vets, will keep kind of challenging owners around that, and maybe using things like sustainability and animal welfare of the ingredient animals as the drivers, rather than just pet welfare, which we know we've been talking about for many years and doesn't seem to change owner behaviour. So maybe adding in some of these other additional drivers for change could help with that. We've also had a question around, do we know which type of food is the most popular, or, which percentage of dogs are fed which type of each diet? Do we have that sort of data?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and actually something that we're working quite hard on at Data at the moment. We have some information on that. Probably the best source is the UK Pet Food, or the Pet Food Manufacturer Association. And in our initial study to estimate the environmental impacts of the UK dog population, we balanced the quantities based on estimates they make. Now, there's a really big caveat there, and that is there's a shift going on in the market at the moment towards subscription foods, especially fresh foods, which are being quite strongly marketed. And actually, most of the data is not picking them up. I have been working for the last several months to try to find out what share of the market these foods now have, so that I can start to factor that into our estimates. And no one has data on it. The subscription foods are not being picked up by the really big commercial companies that collect market data and charge a fortune to access it. They're totally missing it. And I know that that's also a challenge that the pet food industry, the UK Pet Food is finding, is how do we get sort of accurate figures on that? So yes, we have some idea about what's being fed. The figures are in the paper, which you can get a link to on petsandplanet.org. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but I think it's fair to say there's some assumption in that. And when we look in the academic literature, we get surveys of what do people say they're feeding their dogs. Every survey has slightly different methodology. A lot of people feed a lot of different things. So I would say one of the commonest themes, which is that people feed multiple different types of food. And quite a lot of people top up with some home cooked or table scraps as well. So it's quite complicated to give an absolute answer on that.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, and interesting to hear about the subscription models as well. I think, again, a lot of these sort of pet feeding fads do mirror what's happening in human feeding and sort of behaviours. So interesting. Final question we've got time for. So this one, I will read it out. So along the lines of pet food waste and obesity and the number of calories fed, when you were calculating the impact based on that 20-kilo dog, was that on a set calorie allowance for that size of dog, or according to the feeding guidelines given for each food? And if it was the latter, did you look into the number of calories recommended by the different types of food, like with the Bella example?
So again, a really good question. So the way that we did that was we estimated the calorific content of the food based on our estimate of composition using a modified Atwater. So there, what you say is from memory. Yeah. Protein and carbohydrate are 3.5 kilocalories per gram. I think I'm right there. And fat is 85 kilocalories per gram based on what's in the food. And then, so you calculate out an energy density for the food based on that. And then I use the standard formula to calculate based on a standard energy requirement for the dog. So I did not look at the label recommendations at all. It's a really tricky one, because actually I think even the standard formula that I'm applying, which is based on the literature, probably estimates quite high for a lot of dogs. I think we all know that a lot of Labradors do not need to eat close to the number of calories that seem to be suggested when you would calculate it out. When you took the Bella example, I used the figures that were recommended by the manufacturer of that food for how much to feed. And it was pretty much exactly the same as the calculation. Because actually I was looking for that. I was thinking I might illustrate that point and say, well, the manufacturer says feed this much, but actually when I calculate it be less. That wasn't the case at all. So I think that is an issue. And I certainly, from being in practice, I used to find that. I would find that I felt like feeding manufacturers' feeding recommendations seemed to me to be recommending to feed too much. In this case, it wasn't there. And for the 20.1 kilogram dog, no, that's based on a level playing field in terms of how many calories we're trying to feed.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. This is something that I think I've got 1,000 questions and could keep talking about all evening, but we have come to 9 o'clock. So I just want to thank you again, John, massively for all of that, explaining it so well, and such a complicated subject, but so important for us to really get into. I was going to say get our teeth into, but maybe that's inappropriate. But yeah, huge thank you. Thanks to Hannah as well for facilitating. Yeah, lots of great comments and thanks in the chat as well. So, and thank you all for joining us and listening. And it will be available on Catch Up, and the references will be shared as well. So many thanks to you all, especially John.
Thanks, Justine.
Take care. Good night, everyone.